God bless everybody today. Today is September 6th of 2020, and today we're going to go over Revelation complete event calendar in order that they happen in John's vision. This is going to go through the beginning of the sorrows, through tribulation, or up to tribulation, or the signing of the 7-year covenant of death, and show how these transitions in the Bible work. I use the Revised Standard Version Bible 1952 by Thomas Nelson Incorporated, but for most of the article or video, I'm using the King James Version to refer to in this study. Before we get too deep into this article, this review of the last book of Revelation, I just wanted to go and let you know that you can find all my articles on my eschatology site at endofdayssurvival.com. It has videos, the 117 step timeline that I'm working through now with you, that I'm going to show you as we get through this, how this all links together, different videos, articles that I've written about different topics, and how these things all link to the different events, the sorrows, tribulation, and the great tribulation, and how they're going to affect us in the next 7 years. So if you go to my eschatology page, and you go down the page, just right after the main logo, you'll see the 117 step calendar event. If you click on that, that will give you my 117 step timeline flow chart. If you have not watched the video on this, you need to, because it's too hard to explain in this video on how to read it, other than you have 14 main chapters with 3 additional visions that John is having while he's in heaven. He's either given a scroll, or he's told that he's going to be taken into additional vision by an angel, or whatever. And so we have 3 additional visions that have to be cut out because they're not part of the sequential top timeline. There's additional visions that add layering to this top timeline. Those 3 additional visions are chapter 7, the prophecy of the elect, or 144,000, chapter 11, 12, 13, and 14, which are prophecy against the nations and peoples, and 17, 18, and 19, which are prophecy against Mystery Babylon. And you'll see that if you cut these out, you don't need them to make a complete story up here. They just add layering or depth to the story so you can see what's going on the ground about the elect, or the 144,000, and what they're going through. Those 4 chapters about the nations and peoples, and what's going to happen through those 1260 days through tribulation, great tribulation, until the Lord comes back on the 7th trumpet. And then the 3rd set of visions is that Mystery Babylon, 17, 18, and 19. And so if you cut those out, you'll notice that it starts with John's vision of his angels. He writes to the 7 churches. He then sees the Lord being selected, Lord Jesus being selected to break the 7 seals on the 7 scrolls. And what happens then is we start this chain of event of these 4 horsemen coming out and starting to create major devastation and judgments on the planet. And this is a global effect. They're not just to the Middle East, they affect everyone. So the 117 step timeline and flow chart also works with my article on my eschatology page on how Daniel 8:12 and Psalm 90:10 work together to see God's timeline. And I'm going to go through this chart as we're working through everything else, so you can sort of see how this lines up with actual time of where we are today and what's going to be happening in the future. So if you go to the 117 step timeline or flow chart and you zoom into the very beginning of that timeline, you'll notice that I've done a couple things here. I'm not only giving you what's going on in these steps, And you can follow this with your Bible because each of these steps has an additional verse attached to it, or verses, so you can actually follow your King James Version Bible. You can read right along with me in the Bible. I want you to be able to look at this stuff in the Bible as it's being laid out by God, so you can see his plan and not somebody's interpretation. Now, I will place commentary into who Gog is and some things that are happening on the ground, but you can see each of the verses and how they go through the Bible and follow those steps one by one until you get to the end. And I'm going to sort of explain how this all works. So in step 1, John is visited by an angel of Jesus, and he is told to write 7 letters to the 7 churches. So if you go down this timeline, you can see that John is given those. He's visited by the angel in Revelation 1 through 3, and that he then writes 7 letters to the 7 churches in Turkey, and this is Asia Minor. This is Revelation 1:4 through 17, Revelation 2:1 through 29, and Revelation 3:1 through 22. You can see what those letters were, what Jesus was trying to show the churches, what their shortcomings were and what they had done right and what they need to do to modify their behaviors to get to the end and be able to gain the rewards that he gives them at the end when we get to the millennial and to the eternity. So you can follow these verses along, and so I'm not going to keep going over the verses. I want you to be able to see that each of these have an attached verse to them, and so we can then just go through the story, and you can follow these through on your Bible and see where and how all this works together. So as you look at this timeline, you'll notice that I built a text file that runs down this page, and then at the bottom you can actually look at all 22 chapters in the book. I just took them right out of the King James Version Bible and I laid them down here, and then I applied the different steps. The 117 steps up here are applied down here so you can see them. So in reality, you can multi-check this in multiple different areas, because the top works with the main part of the timeline, works with the sub-chapters or the flow chart area down here. This text file of 117 works with this whole group up here, so you can see from step to step to step what's happening here. And you can actually go down to the bottom, and you can, even if you don't have a Bible, you can look at these verses down here, because these verses are taken directly out of the King James Version Bible. And so I wanted you to be able to see how all these different things are laid out and how they work together and how you can cross check and reference these things. And it's not just one thing that you can look at. There's multiple things that you can look at, but you need to understand how to read this book properly and why this warning up here is so important in Revelation 8:13, and why God tells us to watch that 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet, that each have an additional woe, and how it affects how we can see then the sequence chronologically through the Bible. And I'm going to sort of explain how that happens as we go through here. So that now we've sort of seen how I've laid this out, and you can see how each of these components and flow charts sort of work together, and you'll see how this happens as we go through this, because we're going to see these multiple times. So you should be able to easily understand this as we work through this. But at first, the first step, we're going to go through this from start to end, at least up to tribulation and the signing of the covenant of death, because I'm going to have to break this into multiple different videos. The first step is John is visited by an angel from heaven, from Jesus, and that he is then told to write these 7 letters. In step 2, he's told to write these 7 letters to these 7 churches of what their shortcomings are and what they need to work on in the future to modify their behavior to get their rewards. These also allude to all the churches not just the 7 churches in Asia Minor or Turkey. They do allude to all the churches and what each and every church needs to look at and what the shortcomings of these 7 churches were. But each of them had their own good and bad points. And so Jesus wants to explain that these are different examples. You need to be following these examples, and so we can get as many souls and people to heaven as possible in the end. So after John writes the letters to the churches, he is then, only John, not the churches, are taken to heaven. And he sees these images of all the elders, the 24 elders, and what's going on in God's heaven, and all these different things. And he sees the Lamb being selected. Jesus is the only one that is worthy, so he's being selected to open that 7-sealed scroll, and then we watch the 7 seals start to being opened by the Lamb, or the Son of God, which is Jesus himself. So after he goes to heaven, he sees Jesus selected to open the 7 seals, and so that first seal is broken by Jesus himself, and that white horseman comes out. And I've indicated for many times, I wrote many articles about this, you can go read those articles, that I believe the white horseman is the same thing of Ezekiel 38:39 or Gog, and that Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is not the same Gog as Revelation 20, and I've gone into that. They're definitely 2 different Gogs and 2 different wars. But this first Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is what I call the Seals War. It will take us through Seal 1 through 6, and I'll show you how that works and how Erdogan of Turkey is Gog, or the first seal of Revelation, or the new Ottoman Empire, or new Ottoman emperor that will bring forth the new Ottoman Empire and bring forth the caliphate against the Christians and Jews in the next few years. So, as I was saying, you can go to this text file on the right side of the flowchart, and you can see all the commentary that I've been talking about and all the steps, so you can see how all this works in sequence through the Bible and how each of these steps are going to affect us in the near future. And on this chart, I actually added when the sorrows begin, which is at the breaking of the first seal, all the way to the signing of that 7-year covenant of death with Antichrist, which starts at 1260 days. Then we have abomination, which then leads us into Great Tribulation and so forth. So I've added that to this chart. I wanted you to be able to see those demarcations of where those times are. You can see the color-coded stars that go along with all the other sections of this flow chart. But I wanted, and I update it all the time, so this is, it's not static. It constantly is being added to as we see verses and things. The steps don't change. I'm just adding depth to the steps most of the time, because the steps are directly out of the Bible, so it's hard to change the Bible and the steps themselves. But you can see I just updated this on August 30th. But you can see these different steps, and you can read about this and how the white horseman, has the bow and the crown, and how this white horseman is given a crown, okay? He doesn't have a crown. He's an insignificant person to start with, other than he's a leader of a country, but there's a lot of leaders of countries that aren't significant people, okay? But Turkey, or Erdogan, will become a significant player in the Middle East. He does have the second largest army in NATO. He is the largest force over in the Middle East, and he is going to create havoc. And I thought it was really interesting that when he went into Syria on Yom Kippur of last year, which was October 9th, that I believe this is when we broke the first seal, and that this is starting of the sorrows and what was happened since October. And look at what has happened. You've had the corona come out around October in China, and then we were notified in January that this was a problem. And from that time, it seems like everything else has started to domino down, and we're starting to see famine, breakdown of supply chains, and economic upheaval. Even though the markets are up now, we're going to start to see the defaults and all these things occur. People are not getting, are going back to work, but they're not growing new jobs. They're just filling the old jobs, and most of the old jobs aren't there anymore. So this is going to start to domino down, and we're seeing a lot of different types of bubbles effectively occur. But so I wanted to explain how the white horseman, I believe, is Erdogan, how all of these different things, and I've gone on this text file, I've gone to, and I'm not done with any of this. I'm adding to it constantly, but as you can see in step 5, Erdogan will be the new Ottoman emperor. He will rebuild this caliphate, and then I've added all these verses so you can see how each of the verses go down the Bible along with this 117 step flow chart, so you can see how this is constantly happening. I'm going to zoom in so you can see this. So in step 5, you can see all the verses, and I'm adding to these constantly as I find them. I don't have them all here. No one has all the answers, and I can't even tend to say that I do. So just realize that when I'm adding to these things, this is it's not static in any shape or form, and this is constantly, as I'm finding the verses and I'm going through different prophetic books and chapters, I'm adding them once I find the connections, and so you can then see the connections as I'm updating it. You'll see that update over here. So I believe that this man here, which is President Erdogan of Turkey, is the white horseman, or the horseman that is released upon the world, that is the catalyst that brings the sorrows upon the planet and is going to start this Middle Eastern war of a quarter of the planet. And he will be the catalyst. You've got to watch Turkey. The barometer is always Turkey. And so you have to watch two different things, Israel and Turkey, because Israel is a centristic, God's center of power, and Turkey is the center of power of Satan, as indicated in the letter to the churches of Pergamos. We have to look at that letter. It talks about this two-sword edge judgment against this place, which I believe is the fifth bowl. But Turkey is the white horseman. This is Erdogan. I believe he will build that 10-nation horned Muslim 10 nations that will end up in Israel, and I'm going to try to go through and explain how all this works. But so if Erdogan, and even if it's not Erdogan, we believe, at least if you look at biblical structure, we believe it's the leader of Turkey. So even if something would happen to Erdogan, it would be his successor, or whoever the successor is in the time of the end. But that leader is from Turkey. So the first seal is broken. Erdogan is sent out. We saw a major invasion of Syria, and that major invasion of Syria happened on Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur was on October 9th of 2019, which was amazing because that was actually my birthday. So that was sort of unique for me to watch possibly the invasion from Turkey into Syria. This is documented. He has invaded before. But this was a major invasion where he started to build that 30-mile buffer zone. And so this was the major invasion into Turkey. It happened on Yom Kippur. I believe this is when the sorrows began. And so if you look at that Daniel 8, 12, and Psalm 90 chart that I built, you'll realize that if that is the start of the sorrows, then the seals are being broken or starting to break, and that happened in October, and look what's happened up to this point. You know, we've had all of this turmoil in the markets and, you know, global problems, and they're just going to get worse as we get into fall here. But that is going to start what I call the catalyst that brings on the sorrow. So that is that first seal. Okay. So if Erdogan is the first seal in step 5, then he's going to bring forth the next 3 horsemen. Okay. He's going to take peace from the earth. We're seeing everything happen from India and China getting into it, to China getting into it with Australia and us, to everybody else. And it seems like everybody is now at everybody else's throat, and we just can't seem to get along in the world. And so he, on the second seal, that is that peace that's being taken from the earth. Okay. No one's going to see eye to eye. No one's going to get along. People are starting to take sides. And that's another thing we're starting to see form. You know, as you look at these, as Erdogan's starting to reach out into multiple different areas of the world, we're starting to see sides taken. You know, the Saudis are starting to join Israel. You know, these different factions are starting to coalesce either around Erdogan or Israel, and all these different groups are going to start to split, and we're going to start to see this division of Muslim and areas over in the Middle East that aren't part of that 10 region horn that we're going to talk about, and the other groups that are part of the 10 region horn that are going to then be basically the group that ends up in Israel as a 10 region horn with Erdogan as the leader, as Gog. That's going to happen. And as we see him unleashed, and we see this last 7-8 months of devastation upon the planet, and how all this unrest, famine, and all these different things are occurring, and how all these next 3 horsemen are being unleashed. You're talking about, you know, the pieces taken from the earth on the second seal, which is step 6, and then on the third seal, which I believe we're in second and the third seal right now. Okay. We're working into this 4th seal, which is the pale horseman, where a quarter of the earth is being under war and being killed. But we're in that economic upheaval of the 3rd seal, or step 7, and step 6 here, where we're seeing peace taken from the earth, all the rioting. You know, Corona's affecting people's attitudes. They don't want to be locked up. They're, you know, pent up aggression out there. They're not happy with the government. Both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, are so divided between the two that there's just no way they're going to see eye to eye on anything at this point. And so we're seeing all this devastation upon the planet, and the emerging markets are starting to fail. The default rates are starting to hit. We're starting to see the open up the schools and then shut them down. The corona is going to start to flare up in the fall as we see Labor Day and other things start to happen. So as these first seal is broken, which I believe was back on Yom Kippur, or October 1st, we are now starting to watch these additional 3 seals break. And through that, we are going to watch these contractions. That's why they're called the birth pains and sorrows, is you're going to see these contractions. They're just going to constantly hit us. And then you're going to have a little reprieve, and then they're going to hit you. And as you get to that birth, at 1260 days, when the woman comes down and Satan starts to fall into the wilderness, and we see that remnant leave for the 1260 days, it's going to just get worse and worse and worse. And there will be a realization, that aha moment, where you go, wow, this isn't going to improve. So as we see Erdogan, as he's gone forth on October 9th, we've seen the last 3 horsemen start to gallop. We've seen the peace taken from the earth. We see the famine and economic upheaval occur, the rioting and different things. That fourth horseman is going to be when Erdogan really starts to do a major invasion into Syria. And the other thing that's going to happen here between the third and the fourth horseman is we're going to see that Daniel 8 effect. And so this is important to understand what the procession of events that are going to happen so that we can see how this is going to occur. So if Erdogan did break the first seal on Yom Kippur on October 9th of 2019 and start the sorrows, and the sorrows begins from the breaking of the first seal to that signing of the 7-year covenant of death before we start that 1260 days. He is the catalyst that's going to start to bring all these sorrows and woes onto the planet. And as we start to watch him move the Kurds into Iran, and that's part of the Daniel 8 effect. This Daniel 8 prophecy states that the Kurds, or the Medes, will be shoved into Iran, somehow align with Iran, and these two kings will then, these two kingdoms, Iran and the Medes, or the Kurds, will be destroyed by Turkey. And I say that happens around June. We start to see that Daniel 8 2300 days, and I've done a video about this, start to happen. Those 2300 days, those mornings and nights. If you go back from the Feast of Tabernacles of October 17th of 2027, 2300 days, that takes us to June 30th of 2021. And I believe that's when we're going to start to see a major ramp up of a war between Turkey and Iran. Okay, so that's how this chart works. Yes, I know nobody tells you can't pinpoint days and things like that. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just working off of what God tells us in these parables. You can go look at all these different things that I've written. Or wrote articles about or done videos on. But if that is the case and Erdogan did go into Syria and invaded on Yom Kippur, started that catalyst. Last 8 months we've started to see that breakdown. So we're starting to move into this timeline into June 30th where I believe these 2300 days are starting. So if you've been watching Erdogan, he's been pretty heavily in the news here lately. And you'll see that he's starting to affect multiple regions and start to coalesce this 10 Muslim nation of nations that are going to go against Israel. You know, he's in the Aegean Sea striking oil finds. He's in Libya right now. He's invading Libya, and that's going to affect Egypt and a number of countries around the northern part of Africa. He's in the Mediterranean Sea. He's over in Greece. He's affecting Greece over here. He's affecting a number of different fronts right now. And so as we watch him to expand, we'll start to see him form these 10 nations. And they've already pretty much anointed Erdogan as the leader of the Muslim community over here. So as we watch him expand and move into these PowerPoints, we're going to watch him start to push these Kurds out. Excuse me. And as these Kurds get shoved out of Iran or out of Syria into Iraq, they're all going to then have to be moved into, they're almost like refugees. They're being driven out of all their homes. These Kurds have coexisted with these countries for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so as they're being driven out, they're going to be driven out and they're going to align with Iran, and then we're going to see something happen that's going to force Turkey to rush over and destroy both these kingdoms. So as we start to see this breakdown into spring, and we're going to see those waves of corona hit with the flu fall, season and all these different things, we're going to start to see this buildup of this war with Iran and Turkey. And so that's why I added this additional section here on the fourth seal, that we're going to start to see this buildup of the goat ram war of Daniel 8, 1 through 27, and how you're going to see that destruction of these two kings, Iran and the Kurds, and how this then will compel Erdogan to be the new Ottoman Empire. Because once Iran is destroyed, this is going to be a major effect on everything from the global markets to oil prices, to commodity prices, to additional destruction in the Middle East. You know, think about it. If Iran and the Kurds are destroyed, trampled, as Daniel 8 tells us, this is going to have a huge effect on the globe. It's going to have an effect on everything. And it tells us he's going to trample them, and there's no one that can affect these two countries or these two kings, and he's going to destroy them both. So this is going to affect us next spring. Like I said, June 30th, we're going to start to see that effect happen. So if Turkey invaded Syria, and they're building that 30-mile buffer zone in Syria at the beginning of October of last year, he's going to start to make some major pushes into, and he has, into Iraq, he's into Greece, he's starting to affect Libya down here. All these different countries are starting to see alliances and different things form, but some countries aren't going to go along with this. Some of these countries aren't part of the Ten Horn region. Saudi Arabia is not part of the Ten Horn region. Yemen's not part of the Ten Horn region. Egypt's not part of the Ten Horn region. Okay, Jordan's not part of the Ten Horn region, and neither is Israel. So you're going to start to see forming of alliances. The Muslim communities of the 10 horn nations that are listed in Ezekiel 38, 39, and the other nations around them that are going to constantly be insurrection against either Gog or Antichrist as we move into latter days. So for years, we watched Erdogan try to rebuild this Ottoman Empire. He's been trying for years, and he's going to by 2023, because he wants to reinstate that Ottoman Empire as he's stated publicly by 2023. And this is sort of his Ottoman Empire regional map of old to new. Okay, so the old Ottoman Empire of before World War I to the new empire that he's going to rebuild 100 years later. And this is sort of his vision of his map of what he sees the start of this rebuilding of this 10-nation horn. And notice, this hasn't anything to do with Europe. It involves a little part of Greece, the Stan areas up here, the Kazakhstans and all the different Stan areas. It has to deal with Syria. It has to deal with Iran. And look, Iran's absorbed into that region of 10 nations. So he is going to absorb this country over time, and this will affect us greatly on the global level. And notice how the old vision or the old empire of Alexander's resembles the new vision that he has. And this new vision will be ascertained by Erdogan, or the leader of Turkey, which at this time is Erdogan, which is Gog of Ezekiel 38-39, will see this new vision occur by 2023, as he's proclaimed he will do. And after the destruction of these two kings, the Kurds and Iran, we will see this man, Erdogan, compelled forward as the Muslim leader of the whole Middle East region, and he will then be crowned as the new white horseman, or the new Ottoman emperor, that will then rebuild the new Ottoman Empire, that will then build the caliphate against the Jews and the Gentiles as we move forward in the next 7 years. I believe that once Iran and the Kurds are destroyed, that he will gain his Ottoman crown at what I call the tomb of Suleiman Shah. The tomb of Suleiman Shah is located in the northern part of Syria. This is a Turkish-owned tomb in Syria. It has been moved multiple times. It's a center point in Syria. It's actually the point where they actually want to create the central base for the Turkish army, and that then everything will radiate out from that region into Syria. And I believe this is where he will gain his Ottoman crown after he destroys the Kurds in Iran and becomes that new Ottoman Empire. This is sort of what it looks like. This is the location on the map of where it's located. It's just northeast of Manbiji, which has been a huge central point for the U.S. troops. They've had multiple incursions into this area and different things like that. So realize that I believe that the tomb of Suleiman Shah is where he will gain his crown. And if you look at the white horseman, he is given a crown. He doesn't have a crown to start with. He is given a crown and then goes forth and conquers and does conquering. So realize that that white horseman doesn't have a crown. He doesn't have it yet. Erdogan has not been crowned as the Ottoman Emperor and has not been given that crown. But once Daniel 8 happens and the Kurds and Iran are destroyed, then we're going to start to see that Ottoman crowning, the forming of those 10 nations or the horns of the crown of the beast that goes against Israel. These 10 nations will end up in Israel and they will attack them, as Ezekiel 38:39 tells us. And so Daniel 8 and Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecies are all in the seals, okay, or the sorrows. And I'm going to go over how that happens. So as Turkey's starting to push down into Syria, he's created that 30-mile buffer and he's set up all these different outposts, checkpoints, different things like that. He's invaded all these multiple different areas. We're affecting Iraq, we're affecting Greece, we're affecting Libya. As he drives down into here and pushes those Kurds into Iraq and then into Iran and they align, he will then come over and he will destroy them. Okay, so both these nations are destroyed and he then absorbs Iran and the Kurds into this 10-nation horde of nations that are going to end up in Israel by the time they're done. But as he destroys this area over here and absorbs them, and Afghanistan will be affected also by this. Excuse me. We're going to see that christening happen in the northern part of Syria, and then that 10-nation army is going to start to form, and he's going to start to move down through the Middle East, through Iraq, through Saudi Arabia. It's going to affect Yemen and Oman and all these different places, the UAE. He's going to end up in Egypt, and then we're going to see what I call that Daniel 11 effect, where he gets stopped because he's going to get major friction in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and in Egypt. And when he hits here, he's going to hit that, what I call that choke point, where God puts that hook in his mouth and draws him back up to Israel, and he sits between the two seas. And then we're going to see that hour of power where he gives those 10 nations 15 days to go into Israel, and when they touch that Temple Mount, he breaks that 6th seal. So, like I've said, if Erdogan is the first seal, he started to break, he is the catalyst that brings on the sorrows, invaded Syria on October 1st, he's going to end up in Iran around the end of 2021 or so, because the Daniel 8 effect starts on June 30th based on that one chart I was showing you. And so we're going to see that Daniel 8 war start to happen. And then from that, he's then going to drive down into Egypt. And as I said, you got to watch that 2023 date. So by the time you hit 2023, 2024, we're going to start to see that invasion into Israel. So that's what I'm talking about on this chart. Around June 30th, we're going to start to see those 2300 days start to kick in on Daniel 8 and 12, where he talks about the 1290, the 1335, and the 2300 days, and how all these things work hand in hand together. And you're going to start to see that Daniel 8 effect of the Seals War. You're going to see that destruction of the Kurds in Iran. You're going to see him given a crown. And look what's happening. You're having that Shemitah cycle start to happen, where you have the loss of the fortunes of Israel and the destruction of that second temple in 2022, as we talked about before in that video about this chart. And you're going to see that resurrection of that Ottoman Empire, the new crowning of the Ottoman king. And then we're going to start to see that destruction of those 10 nation horns. Once they hit Israel, they get to Egypt, they get stuck there, they get pulled back, they sit between the two seas, they go into Israel, they attack Israel. And Joel 1:2 matter here, because Joel 1 is telling us that they're going to see a locust event as Gog's moving into Israel, as he's forcing these 10 nations into Israel. We're going to see them decimated by a locust plague. At least that's what Joel 1 states. Because we're looking at that Ezekiel 5:12 prophecy of the destruction of a third of the Jews by locusts, a third of the Jews are destroyed by the sword or Gog, and a third of the Jews are taken to the hidden place. So a third of the Jews are going to be under duress of locusts and plagues before Gog even gets to them, okay? And then he goes into Israel, takes over half the country, attacks Jerusalem, and then gets that Temple Mount, and that sixth seal pops. And then what happens? We start to see the selection of the 144,000. You see 7 months burial of Gog's armies, and Gog's dead, and they put them in the valley of Ham Gog, and they're being buried for 7 months. And then you see the weapons being burnt for 7 years, starting to allude to that 7-year tribulation period that's coming up, that signing of that covenant of death. And so what then happens? After that silence of the half hour and the selection of 144,000, we see that seventh seal break and the start of the handing out of the next 4 trumpets, which are going to sound. There's 7 altogether, but the next 4 are going to sound, which is going to start to usher in the 5th trumpet, which is the opening of the bottomless pit, and the 6th trumpet, which is the rising of the Antichrist. So this is one of the reasons I've been telling everyone that the Revelation warning of Revelation 8:13 is so important. This is God's warning to the people on the ground that you need to watch the 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet. Each has an additional attached woe, and there's a reason for this warning to happen. So if you read the book in chronological order, you'll realize that something really cool happens. That warning, or in verse 8:1 and 2 of Revelation 8:1 and 2, it tells us when he breaks the 7th seal, which means all of the 6 seals prior are broken, that then he has a half an hour of silence, and then he hands out the 7 trumpets. You need to look at that verse and make sure that you work your concept around what God says there and not what you think it interprets it to say. So when God tells us plainly in his own words in 2 verses that when he opens the 7th seal, so when he's opened that 7th seal and all the other seals are broken, there's a half an hour of silence, and then, and only then, does he hand out the 7 trumpets. You can't take a seal event and move it into a trumpet or bowl event, because they've already been broken and happened. So that's what I said. It's a chronological event that's happening here. He breaks the 7 seals. There's a half an hour of silence, and then and only then does he hand out those 7 trumpets. This is very important in understanding the chronological sequence of events. You can't change his words to fit your dialogue. So you have to work around what he's telling you here. He's breaking those 7 seals. After he breaks those 7 seals, there's a half an hour of silence, and then we see the 7 trumpets handed out, and I'll explain how that occurs. And so if you look at that 6th seal, and that's what I mean by that 7th chapter is cut out. Okay, it's a vision about what's going to happen to the elect. And so when you look at the 6th seal, which is at the end of Revelation 6:15 and 17, and then you go directly to the 7th seal, which is at the very beginning of 8:1, you realize that there's an additional vision that John's having about the elect and what's happening to them. So you want to take that vision out, because it gives depth to what's going on up here, but it's not required for the main storyline or sequence of events. And you'll notice that the 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet only happens once here, but they're constantly reoccurring down here. And that's what I mean. You got to watch that 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet. They're constantly reoccurring down here. And you can see how that all lines up with these sub-chapters and how that's adding additional depth, because every time you hit this 6th, 7th seal event and you go down through here, you're going to realize that certain other chapters and verses line up with it. And so you can start to see how he layers this down. And even, like I said, in these lower chapters, you can see those verses and how they occur and where they are affecting these main chapter. So as Erdogan is making his way down through the Middle East, he gets down into Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and he starts moving into Egypt. He hits that choke point, and then, as Ezekiel 38:39 tells us, he gets drawn back to between the 2 seas. Okay, and he sits between the 2 seas before he goes into Israel, okay, or into Jerusalem. And this is important because once he gets there, he sits there for a short period of time, and like I said, he gives those nations an hour of power, which is 15 days, to go into Israel, into Jerusalem, and try to take that Temple Mount, which is the most important prize on the planet. It's the most holiest place. This is where everything revolves around this place. And this is what Erdogan's main final goal is going to be. It's not about the spoils. It is about the spoils, but he wants that temple. He wants that holiest place, and he's going to finally get to Israel. He's going to attack Jerusalem, and once he does that, he is going to be devastated on the 6th seal, and it's going to destroy not only the area of the Temple Mount, it will affect all the areas of the 10 regions around him. So all these areas, Turkey, the stand areas up in this area are going to be affected. Iran's going to be affected. Algeria, Libya, or not Algeria, but Libya, Egypt, and Sudan are going to be affected. Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and some of these are neutral players. So you've got to cut out the 10 regions and realize what countries are being affected by this 6th seal judgment that's occurring on these 10 nations as God's destroying them all. And I really shouldn't say that at this point God is destroying these nations, because it's the wrath of the Lamb that's actually destroying these nations. And this is important to understand, okay? In Revelation 6, the Lamb is chosen to open the 7 seals, and so Jesus, the crucified Lamb, is actually opening these seals. Revelation 6 is all about Jesus and the Lamb. Even at the end, the wrath in Revelation 6:16, the wrath of the Lamb is Jesus's wrath, not God's wrath, because the wrath of God is the 7 bowls. And we can show you where that occurs. And that's why I say, if you go from Revelation 10, where he almost blows that 7th trumpet, but he doesn't, And then we have the vision of 11, 12, 13, and 14 of the nations and people. Then if you go to 15:1, immediately he hands out those 7 last plagues, which are the wrath of God. Okay, they're not the wrath of the Lamb. The 6th seal is not the wrath of God. It is the wrath of the Lamb. So there is a very clear distinction about whose wrath this is. There is a Father and there is a Son, and they're 2 different beings. We want to create them as the same, as the Father, as the Son, as the Holy Spirit, but they're not. They're the Father, the Son, and the soul or the Spirit of God himself. So you need to understand there is a division between these 3 things. And so when he says the wrath of the Lamb, we have to understand that this is Jesus's wrath. He is destroying the nations, these 10 nations that have invaded his country, attacked his people. A third have been destroyed by plagues. A third have been destroyed by Gog and the 10 nations that have invaded this country, and the third have fled to the hidden place right before tribulation occurs. So if we back up for a second, you see that first seal break, you see the next 3 horsemen unleashed, which is Daniel 8. We start moving through the Middle East. You get to Egypt, and if you look at Daniel 8, there's a transition there. It tells us that they're going to see these wars between Egypt and Turkey constantly, between the king of the north and the king of the south, and this is constantly going to happen. Between the time Gog is on the ground and he's destroyed on the 6th seal, we're going to see insurrections there and a war between these 2 nations. But then when the Antichrist is on the ground, as you see Daniel 8 transition into that end time of Antichrist, you're going to see that they're also constantly warring. So Antichrist, when he's on the ground, is going to have insurrections between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and all these other countries, and how there's going to be unrest there, and they're going to battle back and forth. So it's never going to be a quiet time over there, but yet, you know, everybody's going over to see the new Antichrist, and we're going to explain sort of how that happens. So we see that 4th seal where we see the core of the world under duress. That's Daniel 8. You see the destruction of the Kurds, Iran. They go down through the Middle East. They end up in Egypt, go up into the Israel, end up between the 2 seas, go into Jerusalem, and then we start to see what happened. The 5th seal martyrs under the altar start to say, Lord, when are you going to take this destruction and all this blood from the saints and the martyrs and things and redeem us? And he says, well, I'm going to give you a white robe and you're going to rest for a short period of time, and then I'm going to break the 6th seal, because I am going to destroy these nations, these tenfold nations that have gone against my people. And now 2/3 of them are dead on the ground between the plagues and Gog, and a third of the remnant is now going to be taken to the hidden place. And then we see that all men are being affected on the planet by that 6th seal. So in step 11, every person, every animal, everything will be affected. You look at that 6th seal. So if you look at that 6th seal terminology, it tells us when he opens that 6th seal, you know, there's a great earthquake that affects the whole world. The sun becomes black as hair or sackcloth. The moon becomes blood. We start to see the falling of the stars, which are Jesus sending down boulders upon these nations that have gone against him. I mean, he's literally devastating them from heaven by surgical strikes on the ground on 10 full nations, and 10 full countries are being affected at the same time, because he's not only affecting the army, he's affecting the countries. He's pummeling these places from fire from heaven, and it's going to affect everything to the point where all men climb under rocks and hope that basically they're going to fall on them, because who's going to live through this madness that's happening on the ground? The only people that are going to know that's really happening are the people of faith and the Christians that know something, and they're going to know that this is a sixth seal event, and that this is going to start to usher in a silencing of a half an hour of silence and the starting of the trumpet phase. So you see that first seal break, you see the Ezekiel war or the Daniel 8 war happen. That builds into the Ezekiel war of 38-39, the destruction of Gog and his armies on the sixth seal. You see the rocks fall on the men of all the world and how this global earthquake affects us on the sixth seal. And it will affect us greatly over here. I don't know to what extent the infrastructure will be affected, but it is why we are preparing our oil and our lamp so we can get through what's coming. Then we start to see from chapter 6 to chapter 8 that seventh seal break, and we see the half an hour of silence, and the seven trumpets are then handed out. So that sixth seal has already happened. It can't happen any time later. It's already happened. All the seven seals are broken at this point. And now we are starting into the trumpet phase, which then leads up to a procession of buildup of events that allows Antichrist to rise. So once Gog is destroyed, his 10 nations are on the ground, and they're in the process of burying these 10 Muslim armies of nations for 7 months, and we start to talk about burning the fuels and the weapons for 7 years. We start to talk about that tribulation period that we've been talking about after the signing of that 7-year covenant, because tribulation doesn't start until the signing of the 7-year covenant. So we're still in the sorrows at this time. And so what happens once that seventh seal breaks and the 7 trumpets are handed out, we start to see major devastation on the planet. A third of the plant life of the earth is destroyed. The second trumpet, a third of the sea and the sea life on earth is destroyed. The third trumpet, a third of the water is diseased, and we see wormwood, which is an asteroid, come down and poison the waters. And then the fourth trumpet, a third of the sun, moon, starlight are removed. And this is right prior to the opening of the bottomless pit on the fifth trumpet. And that warning that I'm talking to you about in Revelation 8:13 and the 3 woes. And this is important because he's warning the nations of what's coming and how he's going to cut that next scene out about the prophecy of the nations and the peoples down here. So this is very, very important. Now the 4 trumpets that devastate a third of the planet. If you take the map of the globe and you lay it out, you'll notice something sort of stands out. You know, we're talking about the Christian nations sort of over here, and the European nations that are somewhat Christian. And you get into the African nations that are being affected by the 10 horns, you'll realize that a third of the planet that could be devastated by these 4 trumpets are what I call the communist areas, all the way down through even maybe Pakistan, India, China, maybe Indonesia, and up in through Russia. And if you draw that section out, you realize that's about a third of the planet. And why would he do that? Because they haven't cared about Jesus in 6,000 years. And I'm not trying to diminish these people in any way, shape, or form. But they're not religious people in Christianity, most of them, not all of them. There's good Muslims, there's good people all over the world, but they have to believe in Jesus to get to heaven. And so if they haven't listened to him for 6,000 years, I'm guessing that he's going to judge them for where they are in life. And so a third of the planet, I believe, and this is my belief, will remove about a third of the countries that are being affected over here, and that will basically take out the communist areas, possibly affect Pakistan, India. It will definitely affect China, Russia, Mongolia, and Indonesia, because he's going to buffer this 10 region horn. And so if you look at the 10 region horn, you're talking about Turkey, Greece, Libya, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, And Afghanistan here, this is the 10 region horn, okay? So he's going to buffer this area. This is the centristic area for both Satan and God. And he's going to buffer it from this area because he doesn't want anyone to affect his plans. So I believe the 4 trumpets will affect the communist areas over here. That will buffer this area. And so the Christians and Jews in this 2/3 of this part of the world will have to make a decision one way or the other who they're going to follow here. So on the 5th trumpet, we have a major effect happen. Michael is standing on this pit. As Revelation 13 tells us, he is pulling Satan out of heaven at that time, and he is throwing him and the 1/3 of the angels that fall with him to earth, and he is going to open that bottomless pit right prior to that, and we're going to see those scorpions come out for 5 months and sting the people without the seal of God prior to this rising of Antichrist. And I think it's an extremely important point that we look at the 4th seal prior to the martyrs and the 6th seal destruction of Gog, because what is happening there? It tells us clearly that the pale horse is being released, and on him sits death. And who's following him? Hell is following him, and Hades, which rules that dominion, is following him. So the bottomless pit on the 5th or on the 4th seal is already being moved to the location of the destruction of Gog on the 6th seal. You can start to see that this is all in play. And right after he starts to move that pit, because he's down in Egypt and then he's being pulled up to between the 2 seas, that pit is moving to his location for this destruction of Gog and the burial of these 10 nations in the valley of Hamon Gog in the northern part of Israel. We're going to see this major area of commerce rise up due to the destruction and cleansing of the land over there, and so we're going to see a lot happening. And so there's going to be a lot of people, reporters, things happening in this region. So if anything goes on in this region, people are going to know about it, because it's going to take 7 months to go through and cleanse this land, and the news media and different things like that are going to be all over it. So if we go back to the timeline, you notice that right after the Seals War and the half an hour of silence, we start to see those 7 trumps hit. And once those 7 trumps start to hit and we see that 5th trump occur with the first woe attached, we start to see that bottomless pit open. And this is important because the 5th trumpet is about the bottomless pit opening and Michael standing on the bottomless pit and bringing Satan from heaven, losing his seat forever, and then throwing him on earth, and then watching this resurrectional event of an Antichrist coming from the bottomless pit from a resurrected Gog. And I'm going to explain how that occurs in a second. But what I'm trying to explain right now is the 5th trumpet is the bottomless pit opening. The 6th trumpet with the 2nd attached woe is the resurrection or the rising of Antichrist. And the 7th trumpet, which is over here, in the 3rd woe, once it's blown, we have that coming back of Jesus from heaven to then start to have the bowls poured out just after his return. And that's the wrath of God, and we see the rapture just prior to the 7 bowls being poured out. So again, we're going to look at this warning in Revelation 8:13, which leads us to these last 3 trumpets with an attached woe on each of them, and realize that this is extremely important. And so we need to understand what he's trying to tell us here. And so that's why I keep saying, if you look at those 3 those 3 additional visions, you'll notice that these last 3 trumpets are occurring in all 3 different visions: the one of the elect, the one of the nations and peoples, and the one of Mystery Babylon. So once that bottomless pit opens, on the 5th trumpet here, on step 19, we see the pit opens, and we watch the locusts come out and torment the people without the seal of God, which is the first woe, has passed, we then start to see what we call the resurrection in Isaiah 14 of Antichrist. And this is a resurrectional event. This will be a resurrection of a Gog that died on the sixth seal, being held in hell by Hades. And then Isaiah 14 clearly tells us, and I've done a video about this, I'm not going to go over all this, he resurrects him out of this grave into Antichrist, and the whole world sees this. Why does the whole world see this? Because we've seen burials occur in Ham and Gog for 7 months, and this is a very televised area at this point because of all the destruction and cleansing that's going on over there. The news media won't stay away from this story, I'll guarantee it. So once this resurrection happens, it's going to be televised. The whole world will see this occur. But I want to show you something that's extremely important between the first seal and the sixth trumpet. A lot is happening here, and this is why you all need to prepare and get your lamp oil ready for a long period of time of 7 years, because if Yom Kippur happened and Erdogan invaded on October 9th and started the seals, well, number one, you're here still, because we're in the, John's already been taken up into heaven, and you're still here. So you're on the ground, you're here, you need to get ready for this madness that's coming up in the next 7 years. Pre-seals rapture is a false teaching of man, and it needs to be thrown out. And if we're already in the seals, then you shouldn't be here, if that's the case. But as we start to see that first seal break, and you start to see that catalyst of the sorrows happen to the sixth trumpet, look what's occurring here. You know, you got devastation of peace being taken away. You got famine, economic upheaval. The markets are going to melt down once Iran gets attacked and destroyed by Turkey. You're going to see death and destruction of a quarter of the planet. The fifth seal martyrs come out and say, hey, when are you going to avenge us for all this destruction? You're going to see a sixth seal pop, a global earthquake event, blood moon event, stars falling on 10 full nations of Muslims, and then we're going to see a half an hour of silence. We're going to see a selection of 144,000, and then he's going to devastate a third of the planet by trumpets. Okay, which are the communist areas. John sees an eagle fly over, warns the nations, hey man, if you haven't figured it out by now, you need to pay attention, and gives us this 3 woe warning. And then the fifth trumpet happens, the pit opens up, and on the sixth trumpet we start to see Antichrist come out. And when he's resurrected, the world is going to be in complete, it's going to be a complete mess on the ground. You know, there's going to be a lot of death and destruction and disease, and the global economies are failing, and we realize at that point Daniel 8's affected Iran. Iran's destroyed and being absorbed. This new caliphate's coming out. 10 full nations are now starting to create a caliphate against the whole world of Muslims, or of Jews and Christians. And these 10 radical nations are going to invade the whole planet at this point. And you've seen a third of the destruction of the communist areas. So it's going to be a mess out here. People are going to be ready for a global reset at this point. When this sixth trumpet happens and Antichrist comes out, those 10 nations will then form into what we call those 4 regions. Those 4 regions are the same regions that we saw back in Alexander, from past to future. This is Daniel 2 to Daniel 7 to Daniel 8. You see that morphing of those kingdoms that we've talked about so many different times. So in the timeline on the text side, in step 10, we see that sixth seal event, how the earthquake event affects us all. And then we start to see, I did this just under here for a reason, because I want you to see how the 7 heads and the 10 horned crowns of the beast kingdom are going to affect us from old to new, or to future, and how the Nebuchadnezzar statue and how all of the different components link from past to future. So you have the Egyptian first kingdom, the Syrian second kingdom, you have the third kingdom, which is Babylon of old, which is Iraq of new, the fourth kingdom, which is the Medo-Persia, which is the Kurds and Iran of new, or the future, that future Daniel 8 effect. Then the sixth kingdom, which is that division of Rome, the sixth, or the eastern and western division. Remember, Rome, or the Roman army, the whole empire was moved to Turkey and Constantinople, Turkey. You have that, then that forming of that seventh kingdom, which we're in now, which is Erdogan, how he's going to form the Muslims into that new Ottoman Empire, and then he's going to die, and then we're going to see that resurrection event. And that's what I keep saying. If you look at the Revelation 17:11, the beast that was, that now is not, is himself the eighth king that belongs to the seven, is going into destruction. It is telling you that he will die. Gog will die on that seventh, or on that sixth seal. That's the seventh kingdom. He will be destroyed. He will be buried, and then he will be resurrected, and we're going to see a number of things happen. Not only will we see the destruction of that Ottoman Empire, because it won't matter after Antichrist comes out, but we will see from that 10 region destruction, you're going to see it form down into 4 regions, as Daniel 8 tells us, and then Antichrist will rise, overthrow the other 3 nations. They'll all be absorbed into the diversified kingdom of the beast kingdom, and that will be the conglomeration of these 3 nations up here: Iraq, the Kurds and Iran, and Turkey, and the Ottoman Empire area of before. They will all be diversified into one full kingdom as a diversified kingdom of the beast now, and so it will be a beast system. And once that happens, he will then be in a position to reset the system. So if you go into this Daniel 8:12 and Psalm 90 chart, you'll notice that if the seals started to break and we started the sorrows on October 9th, and Daniel 8 starts to happen on June 30th, and we start to see this falling of the Jewish fortunes and the rising of the new Ottoman Empire, just as we would have seen in 70 AD. We saw the falling of the fortunes of Israel and the Jews, and the rising of the Babylonians. This will be the same thing, only the rising of the Ottoman Empire by 2022. And as we start to see all this destruction of the Daniel 8 war, Ezekiel 38:39, the selection of those 144,000, the first 4 trumpets sound, we're going to start to see then that resurrection of Antichrist. And now we're into that 2024 date. Like I said, 2023 wants to rebuild that Ottoman Empire. We get into the end of 2023, 2024, we start to see that effect where the trumpets start to hit. We see Antichrist rise on the 6th trumpet after bottomless pit opens on the 5th trumpet. And we start to see then, once he rises, we see something extremely important happen. We see that 1290 days kick in. And if you look at the 1290 days, he tells us clearly, from the time the continual burnt offerings are taken away to the time that abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. And so he stops these sacrifices 30 days prior to the signing, because it stops on abomination. It's a span of time of 1290 days from the time he stops the continual burnt offerings through abomination. Okay, so it's once you see him stop that abomination, or once you see him stop those continual burnt sacrifices, And he proclaims to the Muslim nations or the Jews or whoever that he's in control at this point, and you have to stop these sacrifices and continual burnt offerings. That 30 days after that, we're going to see a signing of a 7-year covenant of death. And I say that happens around April 20th of 2024, because if you work the 1260 days forward to abomination, take the second half, which is shortened from the 1335 days, because he shortens the second half, 75 days. That 1335 days matter on how he says that. It's to the sanctification of the temple. We see that rising of Jesus on the seventh trumpet. There's 15 days between the second and the 17th, the hour of power of God, which are the 7 bowls, and then we tabernacle with God. And so if you look at that, you take those 2300 days and you work back from the sanctification or the reformation of God's kingdom, the restoration of his kingdom, from the Feast of Tabernacles back 2300 days. That takes us to June 30th of 2021. And why does it have to happen in this period? Because Psalm 90:10 tells us that it has to happen before the strong generation is gone. And so the beginning of the generation was on May 14, 1948. The normal generation ended on May 14th of 2018. And the strong generation will end on May 14th of 2028. And what does he tell us? That strong generation will not last before we fly away. So it has to happen before the end of the strong generation. And if you follow the Hebrew calendars of the feasts and all the different associated calendar events of their different holidays and things like that, you'll realize the Feast of Trumpets is extremely important. It is the date of the day of the time when our Lord will come back. And yes, we do not know the hour or the day, because it's a 2-day event and no one knows for sure when that is going to be. I think it will probably happen on the second day of the event, because or actually the first day or the second, because if you take it from the 2nd to the 17th, or those 15 days of God's wrath, and then you get to the Feast of Tabernacles, you have Yom Kippur right before this, in the middle of all this, which is the Day of Atonement, you're going to start to see this pattern form. So once the 6th seal breaks, you have the earthquake event, the 10 nations are destroyed, you start to see the 7th seal open, the half an hour of silence occurs, you start to see the 4 trumpets hit, a third of the communist nations are taken away, and buffers the region of the 10 horns, and also protects the Christian and the Jew regions, because they're going to be made to make a decision here on which side they're going to join. We start to see the 5th trumpet happen. The bottomless pit opens. Step 20 is the locusts come out, the bottomless pit, and when they sting the men for 5 months that don't have the seal of God. Go to step 21, we start to see the 6th trumpet, Antichrist rises, and the second woe occurs, and we start to see this resurrectional event. And then look what happens. On the 6th seal, we see those 4 winds released. So if you look at that prophecy of the elect, at the very beginning of 7, he's telling us that he is holding back the 4 winds, and they're not to blow on the earth. Until when? The 6th trumpet. Once that 6th trumpet occurs, you'll notice the 4 angels that fold the 4 winds are released, and we start into the beginning of the 1260 days right before the beginning of tribulation, which is where this demarcation line is. So once he stops, we see Antichrist rise. They release the 4 winds. The continual burnt offerings are stopped by Antichrist, because he's now resurrected. He's on the ground. He's not on the ground now. Anybody that tells you it's a leader from a nation, or it's Erdogan or anyone right now, Trump or whatever, Obama, I don't care who you say it is. He's not on the ground right now because he's a resurrected event anyway. He's a resurrected person from Gog. Gog is not dead, and that is a leader of Turkey. So Antichrist is not on the ground, and he's not a man. No one is going to follow Macron of France or anyone. This is going to be a supernatural event. It will be a supernatural person that the world follows. And so realize that once the sixth trumpet happens, Antichrist is brought forward, rises resurrected out of the ground from a dead Gog. He releases those four winds. Then we start to see the continual burnt sacrifices stop. You see those four regions turn into one diversified beast kingdom. And then we start to prepare for the tribulation period of 1260 days. And so once he stops those continual burnt offerings and he signs that treaty with the nations 30 days later, we start into tribulation. And what then occurs is we will see 1260 days to abomination. At the beginning of the 1260 days, there's another thing that we can show through biblical verse that will happen. Once that 1260 days happens and the signing of the covenant of death occurs with the nations, and we start into the 1260 days, the 42 months or 3.5 years, we will see the two witnesses appear and start to prophesy for 1260 days. And this is why subchapter 11 is cut out. And it stands on its own. All four chapters of the nations and people, the vision that John sees about chapter 11, 12, 13, and 14 all stand on their own. But you got to realize that chapter 11 is mainly about the two witnesses. It talks about how the two witnesses come out, how they're going to stand and prophesy against Antichrist for 1260 days, and then after abomination they're overcome and lie in the street for 3.5 days, and then after 3.5 days they're resurrected and taken to heaven. And this is the sign to everyone, even Antichrist, and to the churches and to the people and to the nations and everybody at that point. When you see those two witnesses rise, that this story's over, and that he shortens that second half for a reason, because once abomination occurs, he's going to lash out. He knows that this story's getting to the end, and he's going to lash out like a child, and he's going to go on this destructive mode, and he's going to try to cleanse as many of the sealed of God off the planet before he knows his ending is at the second half, which is 75 days. And so that's what I keep talking about, this small Daniel 8, 12, and Psalm 90 chart is after that abomination occurs, he talks about those 1335 days. He talks about it from the signing of the treaty and how his people are going to have a shortened half. His saints, his martyrs, his elect are going to have a shortened half to make it to the end, or there won't be any of them left. And so he cuts that down to 75 days. How does that happen? You take the 1335 days minus the 1260 days, that gives you 75 days. You move that from the signing of the covenant of death forward 75 days after abomination. You get to the Feast of Trumpets. That's when the Lord comes back. He raptures these people out of there. Remember, these are the people of great tribulation that he's rapturing. Tells you great tribulation. Whether they include the sealed martyrs and others, I don't know, because the books don't open till later, and he only indicates this as the great tribulation people and the people that have made it through the worst possible times as they're being basically eradicated from the planet. And then we start into God's last few days of wrath. The 15 days are the hour of God, where he destroys Mystery Babylon and all the nations in Armageddon on the 6th bowl and through the 7 bowl event. So when you get to step 21, after the pit opens on step 19 here, we see Antichrist rise, we see the four winds released, They start to prepare us for the 42 months, 1260 days, or the 3.5 years to abomination. Michael comes down from heaven wrapped in a cloth, and then he gives him a scroll. He gives John a scroll, and he says, listen, you're not going to sound that seventh trumpet. We're not going to sound it at the end of 10, and I'm going to explain to you about this prophecy of the nations and peoples. And then we're going to sound the seventh trumpet on the beginning of 15. So you see this transition from 10:5, where Michael is standing on the bottomless pit. He hands out that scroll, and then he doesn't blow that trumpet, but he does in 15:1. And the reason he does that is he wants to break out these other 4 chapters, so you can see the prophecy of the nations, the peoples, and what there is going on the ground through chapter 11, through chapter 12, through chapter 13, and chapter 14, and it breaks it down. It gives you, it zooms in, it gives you vision. You get to see what's going on the ground through all this layering effect. But when you get to the seventh trumpet, which occurs in Revelation 15:1, you realize there's a reason for this transitional period, and that he's taking us from the sixth trumpet to the seventh trumpet, and he's cutting out that additional vision so you can see what's going on between the sixth and seventh trumpet. Because think about this. There's a lot happening between the sixth and seventh trumpet. You have the rise of Antichrist, 1260 days to abomination. Abomination happens. 75 days after that, you see great tribulation start to occur, and then you see a resurrection or a rapture of the elects and saints here. And then you get into what we call the bowl phase, because Jesus comes back on the seventh trumpet here in step 29. The kingdom has now become the kingdom of the Lord, because guess what? He's now back on the planet, dipped in blood, and he's going to go against war against all the other nations, because the people of God have been taken away at this point during the rapture here in 32. So God sends his son back on the seventh trumpet. The kingdom's now his. He owns it. He's got the title deed in 30. He returns on the white horse with all his armies on the seventh trumpet, and God's wrath. And you can see these steps as we work through here. Rapture occurs of all the saints, martyrs, and the people that have gone through great tribulation. And then what happens? He hands out the 7 bowls to the 7 angels, and we start to see the 7 bowls start to happen as we start to move through here. So it's important that we understand the structure. And so you can see this up here. It's real easy to understand. Jesus comes back, you have the rapture, and then we start to see the 7 bowls handed out, and we start to work into the war of Armageddon. So to go back just a minute, the pit opens on the 5th trumpet. We see the locusts come out. We see the Antichrist rise on the 6th trumpet. We see the winds released, the 4 winds released. We start to prepare for the 1260 days or 42 months or 3.5 years. Then we start to see this build up to abomination of 3.5 years, or the halfway mark. That's 1260 days. Then you see that shortening of the second half, which is the 75 days between abomination and the rapture of the saints over here. Then once we see the 7th trumpet hit, and our Lord comes back with the angels that go against the wicked left on the ground, he's going to come back with his armies from heaven. He owns the planet now. He owns the title deed. That rapture is going to happen of the elect, saint, and martyrs, and then we start to see the starting of the bowl phase. So God hands out the 7 vials. Step 34, the temple of the tabernacle is opened. Step 35, we see the Ark of the Testament is seen. Step 36, there is lightnings and voices and thunderings and earthquakes and all kinds of stuff, great hail, all kinds of stuff. There's this build up to the start of the seals. We're seeing the 7 bowls being held by the 7 angels. The 7 angels come out of the temples with the 7 plagues. One of the 4 beasts gives the 7 angels the 7 bowls. In step 39, we go into step 40. The temple is filled with smoke and the glory, and no man can enter the temple until the 7 bowls, or God's wrath. God's wrath is only the 7 bowls. Remember, the 6 seals, the wrath of the Lamb. It's not the same. The 7 bowls are God's wrath. Okay, and once God starts to release his wrath, and look at that, 41, a great voice from the temple of God calls out to the 7 angels, start my wrath. I am done with this madness, and I am going to lay down wrath upon what's left, and they're the wicked. Okay, so God is now releasing his wrath, not the wrath of the 6th seal and the Lamb of the destruction of God, which was on the 6th seal prior. So we start to see these bowls start to drop. He drops the first bowl out on man, which are grievous sores and all kinds of different things that they have to physically deal with. And then he pours out the second bowl on the sea, which destroys the sea and all the plant, all the fish, and everything dies in the sea. And the third bowl, which is step 44, is he pours it into the waters, and the waters become poisoned. And then the fourth one is he pours it on the sun, and so the sun scorches men, and they curse men for the plagues that are being thrown down upon them. And then look at that, the 5th bowl is talking about it being poured out on the beast of the sea, or the seed of the beast, which is Pergamus, Turkey, which is Mystery Babylon. Been saying this for a while. I've done a whole video on this. It's about an hour and a half long if you want to go see the connections between Mystery Babylon and why I believe this is the case. I'm not going to do that here, but I do believe Mystery Babylon is the warning of the letter to the churches, the 7 churches, to Pergamus, that this is the 2-edged sword judgment that will go against them, and that he will clean this place, and that no one will inhabit this place, because it will only be for devils and demons after he's done with it. And that this horror will be lashed out against the nations at the end. They will then ransack, loot this place, and rape the whore that raped the world. And then we start to see Isaiah 21 happen. Isaiah 21 is the destruction of Mystery Babylon. It tells us clearly this is Mystery Babylon. It's being destroyed. It's fallen, and that we're having a mass exodus out of this place into Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and all these people are starting to disperse and leave this place that's being destroyed by God, and it'll be like a volcano going off in this region called Turkey, and Pergamus, Turkey will be destroyed all in one shot. But we're going to see this build up then after the destruction of Mystery Babylon, wherever that might be. And you may not agree with my Mystery Babylon concept or theory. You may think it's somewhere else like Mecca. That's fine. I don't believe there's any passages that tell us directly that it is, but there is one here that tells us clearly that he's going to pour this out on the seed of the beast, and the seed of the beast is written to the letter of the 7 churches, and that tells us that is Pergamus. So I'm going to go with what God tells me and not what I think it means. Once you see the 6th bowl drop, and you see the three unclean frogs come out of the mouth of Satan, Antichrist, and the false prophet, then you will start to see the battle of Armageddon. And then after that occurs, and there's that last cleansing, he drops the 7th bowl in the air, and we see that basically the throne of God is now starting to descend upon the planet. He's reforming his new heaven with earth and combining them, re-fermenting the planet as it was back in Adam and Eve's day, and rechanging it into the millennial kingdom of 1,000 years that Jesus will reign over, okay? And so this is extremely important to see how this happens. And so once you see that Jesus rises or comes down from heaven on the seventh trumpet, we see that resurrection of the rapture of the elect saints and martyrs. We see the seven bowls start to happen. We see the destruction of the fifth bowl of Mystery Babylon, the sixth bowl of Armageddon, and the seventh bowl of the cleansing of the planet. Then, and only then, again, we see what? Thunderings and lightnings and all that stuff. Well, that's happened many, many times back here. It happens in 36. It happened because it's happening in heaven, not on the planet. These are different thunderings and lightnings. They're happening in a different region called heaven. Now this region's on the planet, so it's been reformatted into a new kingdom on earth. And so he is now dividing Mystery Babylon. In 52, it tells us he's going to divide Mystery Babylon into three. Okay? And when did that happen? In 46, where he's already dropped the bowl. So now he breaks this place into three pieces, and no one will ever want to go there again, because it's only going to be able to be lived in by demons, or no one would want to go there anyway because it's polluted and toxic, sort of like radiated. And so no one's going to want to go there. So once he pours that seventh bowl out in the air and reconstitutes the planet as a new kingdom, then we start to see that opening of the books of life and different things like that. So he divides that city, Mystery Babylon, in three pieces, and all mountains and islands are no longer found. So he's rechanged the whole planet. The angel comes down from heaven having the key to the bottomless pit in his hand. And look at that. There's that third transition that I was talking about. From the bowl phase, the seven bowls, to the beginning of his new kingdom. So if you go from chapter 15 and 16, which are all about the bowls, 16 starting of the bowls to the end of the seventh bowl, then you go from what? The end of 16 to 20, because what happens? You see those these three frogs come out of their mouth, and what does he do? He throws Antichrist and false prophet in the lake of fire. And then in 20, he what? Binds Satan for 1,000 years. And he puts him in the bottomless pit. Okay? So this is important. So now at this time in step 55, Satan is now in the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. Okay? So in 56, it tells you that. And he will be loosened after that 1,000 years. And he will then go out to deceive the people from great tribulation that have made it into the kingdom of the Lord, and for the 1,000 years. And the 1,000 years is not for the masses, and I'm going to go over that here in a short period of time. This 1,000 years are for his teachers, his priests, his hierarchy that are going to set up the new kingdom. So they'll rule over the masses. They'll be taught for 1,000 years what they should know, and the laws of the Torah, all the different things God wants us to know. All these things are going to be taught to these people. And then once the book of life is opened, later in Revelation 20, as we're going to show you, the book of life is opened, and then all the rest are then raptured in what I call the second rapture. But this first rapture is for the elect saints and martyrs from great tribulation. They will be tested at the end of the 1,000 years. And this is why we know that the Gog of Revelation 20 is not the same as Ezekiel 38, 39. Because once they've been deceived, and he is released after that 1,000 years, and he deceives those people at the end of the 1,000 years, he destroys them by fire from his own hand. So in Revelation 28, now we're from 16 to 20, go from the end of 16 to 20, go to Revelation 20, we see that the Antichrist and the false prophet are in the lake of fire. He comes out, deceives the nations. Revelation 28 says he goes out, deceives the nations. We have the second Gog-Magog war. And then they encompass the camps of the saints, and look what happens here. This is so important in the understanding between Ezekiel 38 and 39 and Revelation 20. God, in Revelation 20, verse 9, once they encompass the saints' camps, fire from God out of heaven come down and devours them. They are not buried as they are in Ezekiel 38-39 for 7 months. These people are destroyed, okay, by God's hand. And that is why they never see the second death, because the books of life are never opened for these people, and they are devoured by God's hand himself, never buried for 7 months in a grave of flesh, and that they will never be judged in the book of life, so they will never see the lake of fire. They will never be judged either for the millennium or for the eternity and be able to stay with God, or that they're being judged due to them falling during the second Gog-Magog war and then being placed in the lake of fire. They never have that option. They're devoured by God's hand himself by fire. They never see that lake of fire. And so once Satan goes out and he has this second Magog war, we're going to start to see them devoured by fire. And then what happens? Right after this, we have the start of what I call the second rapture. Satan is thrown in the lake of fire, where Antichrist and the false prophet already are, and they will be tormented forever and ever. The great white throne then appears with God on it. So he is now on earth. He is in his kingdom, sitting on the planet on earth. And guess what happens? All men, great and dead, are now being raptured, taken up, because what does it tell us? In 66, and you can see this up here, I've sort of demarcated all these different things so you can see it. The great and the small stand before God. This is the second rapture. All the people except the martyrs and the elect from the first rapture that we talked about, everyone else now is being raptured up. The books of life are then opened. The dead are according to their works are judged. And where are they coming from? These people are coming from the sea, the people that have died in the sea, the people that are in hell and are being delivered up here, and also the people from the ground. So the dead are being judged for their works here in the books of life. And once they're judged, everyone from the planet, the sea, and in hell, whoever is not found in the book of life, is cast into the lake of fire. Okay? So this is when the second rapture occurs. This is when the masses will join. Most people won't see the first rapture or the 1,000 years, because this is for his hierarchy. These are the people that have made it through the worst possible times. They've stood by him. They've died for their word in his truth, and they're being then brought to heaven to be taught so that they can then stand as a kingdom and his hierarchy for the masses that occur over here. And then what happens? He sees the new heaven and the earth are together. John sees the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And he sees then a voice from heaven saying that the tabernacle is with men. God is on the earth. He is with men, and he is with us, and we will tabernacle or be with him for eternity. And that's what this last star is on the 74, is the tabernacling or the joining of God with the people that have made it through everything at the end. And so we will then be with him for eternity, because all of the wicked have now been thrown in the lake of fire. Antichrist, Satan, and the false prophet are all in the lake of fire at this point. And so that's all gone. and he wipes all the tears away, and we're all spiritual beings because now we're into the new eternity and we don't last that long as flesh. And so that's why I say even probably the millennial people are spiritual because they don't last for 1,000 years. And yes, in Genesis some of those people did last 1,000 years, so we don't know what form exactly we're going to be in for the millennial or even the eternity, but I'm guessing that they're spiritual beings in nature and really don't have anything to do with flesh, since all cold and death and tears and everything are wiped away. There's no more disease, there's no more famine, there's no more any of that stuff. So we're not human flesh beings anymore, at least in my opinion. So as we see this tabernacling, and then God will wipe our tears away. We will have death no more, no more sorrows, no more crying, no more pain. All that passes away, and God will make all things new. He tells us that He is the way, He's the Alpha, the Omega, and then He starts to explain about what His new kingdom looks like, and how this new kingdom's built, and all the different things, and how large it is, and all the different things that happen at the end. I'm not going to go into that. You can read about the very beautiful ending at the end and all the gifts that we get. That's not what this is about. This is about getting us to the end. So if you want to hear about all the rewards and everything, you can read the last part of the Bible, and that starts at Revelation 21. Tells you all about the beautiful gifts and everything. And this is important because this is the hope. The rewards at the end are what we're trying to get to. Trying to get us to the end of this nightmare that's coming, this 7 years that's coming in front of us. So if you go back to the Daniel 8, 12, and 90, Psalm 90:10 timeline, you'll notice that I broke this down for a reason, and it explains to you the time frames that this is all going to happen. And we're going to all probably be here for most of the 7 years. I'm not planning on going out easily on this one, so hopefully God will take me into this picture as far as we can get, and I hope I'm wrong in a lot of ways. I've been trying to, disprove a lot of these theories and things, but when you go in and you start to break down these things and realize that this is a timeline and it is a chronological event that occurs here, that God has given a sequential book that if we know how to read it and we follow His warnings over here, that tells us that we have to watch this warning for a reason, and that it affects this 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is because when He gives him these additional 3 visions, it then radiates down into all these sub-chapters and all this different zooming effect, this layering effect that He's trying to get us to understand on the ground. I mean, these sub-chapters are here to open up what's going on between these events. They're zooming in to give you depth and allow you to see what's happening on the ground. But you need to understand this is a chronological event, and that when you go into here, this is important. You have 7 seals. Then once they're broken, He hands out 7 trumpets, and you have 7 trumpets occur. And then once the 7 trumpets happen, the Lord comes back, and then the rapture of the saints occur before He starts to drop down the 7 bowls of wrath, of God's wrath, and that the 6th seal back here, wrath, is the wrath of the Lamb or wrath of Jesus, and that He's affecting everything over here in this area. But it's not till you get to the bowls that we see the effect of God's wrath here. And once you start to see this breakdown, you'll then start to see how this affects everything and how this timeline matters, and it is sequential. I've written this down so you can see these transitions. There's 117 steps from beginning to end. We can see certain demarcations, and that if we go to this timeline here, we can actually see the breakdown of about when these events are going to occur. And so, like I said, and this is important, if Erdogan was the catalyst that broke the first seal and started us into the sorrows, as we start to work through this devastation of corona and economic meltdown into the Daniel 8 effect that starts sometime after June 30th of next year, and we start to see that the fortune of Israel's taken away, the Ottoman Empire rise, and we start to see this resurrectional event of Antichrist. And as we work this into the next 7 years, what's coming, you need to prepare your oil and your lamp. You need to get ready. The next 6 months are going to change everything. And so you need to start getting canned foods and things ready on the ground, because you not only you have to take care of yourself, your loved ones, and the people that you care about, your friends and other Christians and Jews in the room and people that need help, you still have to have enough oil to get to here. If you can get that far. And it's going to be a brutal ride from here to here. And if you haven't prepared, my guess is you're going to have a rough ride. So I hope this has helped you understand the timelines, the graphs, and all the different components that I put together so that you can start to see how this is going to unfold, how this timeline here matters, how each and every one of these charts work together, how that if you go over here, you can see each and every one of these steps. And I've broken all these things down and added them to this text file so you can see how the 117 steps affect you from beginning to end, and how you can go down here on the bottom and also effectively look at all the different steps and how they're laid out in the 22 chapters. And so you can see how all this overlays each other and how it affects us and how it's going to affect us in the next 7 years. If you haven't got right with Lord, if you don't know that Jesus is the open door, the only door, the narrow door, and you haven't found him, you need to get right with him now, because this is going to change quickly. And like I said, I've had those 2 dreams of acceleration where we're going to come to that realization that this is just going to fail, and that at that point it's just too late to get ready. You know, you can try, but when you're trying to do that on the run, good luck. I've been trying to get ready for years and I'm not ready yet. So I'm guessing if you're trying to do that at the very last minute, it's probably not going to work out very well. And due to that, you will make bad decisions because you weren't prepared, and you're watching the people around you suffer, and you're going to end up doing things that probably you wouldn't normally do to survive. And it's just that simple. So prepare your oil and get ready for the 7-year ride, because it is going to get pretty crazy. So God bless you all, and hopefully this helps you to see the full picture of God's plan.